Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. I'm so happy to be with you all. And I think we're going to have a great time today learning about Edgar Allan Poe and his life and works. Let me share the screen now. Um, Bring up my PowerPoint. Okay. Um, just 1 second. Okay,
There you go.
okay. Okay, so we are calling this class Edgar Allan Poe, Meet the Man Behind the Myth. Um, and what we plan to do in this class is discuss highlights of Poe's life, important people who influenced him, some major life events that affected his writing and ways of looking at the world. And we're going to discuss some of his most famous works and his influence on other writers. So it's good for you to know that we just released a 3-hour, 2-part documentary. It's called In Search of Edgar Allan Poe. So we're going to be showing clips from that film throughout the presentation. And yeah, so let's start with his childhood and youth. So Edgar is born in Boston to 2 actors. He has an older brother, Henry, and a younger sister, Rosalie. So, he's a middle child. His mother, Eliza Poe, was a talented actress. This is what she looked like when she was on stage. As you can see, she's performing here. She had a wonderful voice. She performed in over 300 roles, which is really a staggering number. Her husband, David Poe, not such a good actor. He got bad reviews, and that was a source of some family jealousy and, kind of family rivalry there. But when Edgar is just 2 years old, he suffers from one of the first great losses of his life. And as we're going to see throughout this presentation, loss, personal loss, is a very major theme in his life and in some of his works as well. So when he's just 2 years old, David deserts his young family and vanishes. I mean, nobody knows where he went. So you can imagine the effect this must have had on Poe's psychology, feelings of abandonment. This leaves Eliza Poe in a very precarious position. Acting wasn't that stable of a profession. They're always moving around. She has to raise 3 children on her own. But then the worst thing that could happen happens, and that is she contracts tuberculosis or consumption, as it's known. And she has to stop acting. A local theater raises some money for her, but the disease takes her very quickly. And there's a very sad scene where she's lying on her deathbed, surrounded by her 3 children. And that is the end of Eliza Poe's life. And she dies at age 24. So Edgar becomes an orphan at 2 years old. And not only that, but he's also separated from his brother and sister. So his brother lives with a family in Baltimore. His sister lives with a family in Virginia. And, he's not even 3 years old, and he's already lost his mother, his father. And by the way, his father does die only several days after the mother. And that's a total coincidence. They didn't know that. But remarkably, they died just several days apart. So now Edgar is an orphan without his family, very, very young age. He's adopted by John and Frances Allen of Richmond, Virginia. They're a pretty wealthy couple. They don't have any children of their own, and they, wanted to have children. Here's an image of John Allen. This is what he looked like. John Allen was kind of a gruff guy. He was in the mercantile business. He traded in tobacco, agricultural supplies. He was a very kind of practical, down-to-earth kind of guy. Had a very complicated relationship with Edgar. Sometimes they would get along well, other times they wouldn't. But as Edgar gets older, the relationship deteriorates. This is Frances Allen. Frances Allen had a totally different personality. She was very gentle. She was very loving. So that's really important to say because she was really the only source of affection in his life to that point was his foster father, foster mother, Frances Allen. Um, so John Allen moves the family to London for 5 years to expand his mercantile business. Interestingly enough, this is they're on the ship right around the time when Napoleon is losing the Battle of Waterloo. That's the exact time they're going over to Europe. Um, they will be there for 5 years. So an interesting fact here, this is the only time that that Edgar travels abroad in his entire life. And it's interesting because his stories often take place in foreign countries. So that could have been like an early influence on his work. The business venture really doesn't work out. And in 1820, the Allens returned to Richmond. And at this point, Poe is really more cosmopolitan than his Richmond peers. He sees the world a little differently, having had 5 years abroad. Now, one thing that's really important about Edgar Allan Poe is that he was never formally adopted by his family. He was always the foster child. They were always the foster parents. And I think it's a really important question to ask. What effect might this have had on Edgar? Because really, it's a rejection, right? I mean, he was living with them, and he really was part of the family. So why didn't he become officially adopted? And when he got older and understood sort of the ramifications of that, it was a source of rejection. And I think some critics have pointed out that this was a source of some anger for him and could have been maybe some of the motivation in some of the characters, the father figure characters in some of the stories. Of course, this is also how Edgar gets his middle name, Allan, from the Allens, and he'd be known to the world as Edgar Allan Poe. So, kind of an interesting fact here, when Edgar is 15 years old, he becomes famous for swimming 6 miles in the James River in Richmond under a hot summer sun, part of the way against a strong tide. Now, the amazing thing is he still holds the record to this day. I mean, that's amazing to say, right? I mean, here we are in 2024, and he did this in, I guess, 1824, about 100 years, 200 years ago, and he still holds the record. So this was something he was very proud of and would boast of. Now, as Edgar grows older, he becomes more withdrawn and isolated from his classmates. He loves poetry. He always considered himself a poet at heart, and he loved Lord Byron, and he often was an enthusiastic reader of Lord Byron's poetry, and kind of, had him as a role model. So, in his later poem Alone, Poe expresses how his feelings differed from those of his peers.
From childhood's hour, I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source, I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone. And all I loved alone.
So this theme of feeling like an outsider can be seen throughout his life and many of his works. But then something kind of amazing happens in Poe's life. He's a friend of Robert in school, and Robert has a mother named Jane Stannard. And when Jane Stannard is about 30 and Poe is about 15, and when Poe meets Jane Stannard, there really is this sort of amazing connection that they have. They just really have this amazing relationship where Jane is kind of like the mother, the motherly figure, and Poe is kind of fascinated by her. And when he's having problems at home, a lot of times he would be arguing with his foster father, John Allen, or if he's feeling unhappy, he would often visit the Stannards and visit Jane. And he really, had a wonderful relationship with her. But then tragedy strikes, and Now, Jane suffered from what we would call today as from major depression. And it's unclear how she dies, but it may be related to mental health issues. It's not entirely clear, but she dies at age 31. So they barely have any time to get to know each other, maybe less than a year before she passes away. And Poe is very moved by her death. And he writes one of his most famous poems, To Helen, in which he compares Jane to Helen of Troy.
He later wrote a famous love lyric about her called To Helen, changing Jane to the classical figure Helen of Troy, comparing Jane to that ideal.
Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore, that gently o'er a perfumed sea the weary, way-worn wanderer bore to his own native shore. On desperate seas long wont to roam, thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face, thy naiad airs have brought me home to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. Lo, in yon brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand. Ah, Psyche, from the regions which are Holy Land.
So Edgar is getting to clash a lot with his foster father. He's not very happy at home. And the decision is made that he's going to decamp to the University of Virginia in February 1826. Now, this was an amazing time to be at UVA because it had just opened the year before, and Thomas Jefferson was still alive, which is really sort of an amazing thing to say because Thomas Jefferson does die in 1826. So all the students, the hundreds of thousands of students who have attended UVA, of course, never had that opportunity. But wouldn't you know it, the brief time that Poe is there, so is Thomas Jefferson living right across the way at Monticello. So could they have met? Absolutely, because we know that Thomas Jefferson on Sundays often invited students to dine with him. And it's certainly very possible that Poe was one of those students. So as many of you know, Thomas Jefferson played a large role in creating the University of Virginia. He designed the buildings, he planned the curriculum, and it was really his vision. So Poe takes classes in the schools of ancient and modern languages. You know, he always had a love and a fascination for language. He takes classes in Greek and Latin, French, Spanish, and Italian. And he really excels. He's an excellent student. And it's important to note that he will use these foreign words or phrases in many of his future works. So interesting fact, when Poe is examined, he is examined by 2 US presidents. And, you know, talk about nerve-wracking. You know, hard enough to be examined by any professor, but imagine being examined by President James Madison and President James Monroe. So very interesting tidbit there. But he does very well. UVA was a very wild place back then. Yes, Thomas Jefferson had sort of this Enlightenment vision of the university, but in reality, there were lots of fights. It was very unruly, kind of a crazy place. Poe's problem is he struggles financially. His foster father, John Allan, pays very little towards his tuition, and Edgar is kind of stuck. So he's kind of racking up debts with his tuition and so forth. So he takes up gambling to pay his debts. The problem, though, is that he's actually a really bad gambler, and he keeps on losing. So he just keeps digging the hole bigger and bigger for himself until, you know, just he has to leave the university. Now, the amazing thing is, and one theme I'm emphasizing in this is kind of the amazing star-crossed life that he led. Some of the things we've already mentioned. Here's another thing that's amazing: the Raven Room, and this is the Raven Room. Okay, this is how it looks. So nobody is allowed to live in Poe's room. they preserve Poe's room when he was at the University of Virginia to this very day. And this is what it looks like. So even though he was only there for less than a year, that one room is totally preserved. So Poe is forced to leave the university. He returns home and he's miserable. There's lots of arguing. He's very unhappy. He feels that his father, his foster father, has sort of, in a sense, betrayed him by not giving him much support at all. And at a certain point, he just has it. He decides to leave Virginia and to decamp to Boston. Boston was his mother's favorite city, and she always spoke very glowingly of Boston. She also left him a watercolor of Boston to always remember the city by. So he decides to kind of go to Boston. He enlists in the army for 5 years, and he does so under a false name, Edgar A. Perry, basically to dodge creditors. So now he's entering military life. Again, here's another amazing example of leading a star-crossed life. So the year is 1827, and he self-publishes something called Tamerlane and Other Poems. Remember, he's only writing poetry these days. It's a 40-page pamphlet, and he publishes it under the name By a Bostonian. So he doesn't even put his own name on it. Only 50 copies are printed, of which 12 survive. So it's virtually ignored. By the way, if you guys can make sure you're all on mute, because I think I could hear some sounds, that would be really great. So this is his pamphlet is virtually ignored by the press, doesn't really get reviews. But if you talk about irony, this self-published pamphlet that nobody really pays attention to is the most valuable work of literature in American literature today. Number one. So when it was auctioned at Christie's recently, it was sold for about $750,000. Just a really small pamphlet. So pretty amazing. So he's first stationed in Boston, just for a little while, and then he's deployed to Sullivan Island in South Carolina. Now, Sullivan Island is a very grim place. There's really not much to do. Poe is an artificer, and his job is to make the gunpowder and the powder that goes off, and when it's shot at the enemy. It's actually a really dangerous job. You really have to be very careful and know what you're doing, or you can really get injured. Poe is very good at it. So he's on this island, and he's kind of getting bored after a while. There's really not much to do. But this island will be the setting for Poe's most popular short story called The Gold Bug, which he writes later on in life, but it's set in this island. And in this story, it's about a man and his servant who use a secret code to hunt for buried treasure. So interesting fact, this story, The Gold Bug, popularizes cryptography. So even the New York Times today, if you look at the game section, like where they have the crossword puzzle, a lot of times they'll have a cryptogram, and you can decode it. So this idea of course, cryptograms have been around for thousands and thousands of years, of course, and cryptography, but Poe is the one who popularizes it and actually, has newspapers publish it as kind of like entertainment or fun. So The Gold Bug, later in life, Poe has a newspaper column in which he invites readers to send in cryptograms, which he decodes. So it's interesting to note that The Gold Bug inspires William Friedman to become a code breaker. And William Friedman, and here's a picture of him, William Friedman is considered the greatest code breaker in United States history. And he has William Friedman has a very important role to play because he is instrumental in breaking the Japanese purple cipher, which helps the Allies defeat Japan in World War II. So William Friedman often spoke about how Poe and The Gold Bug specifically influenced him to become a code breaker. He read it as a boy. Friedman said he loved Poe, and he cites Poe as a major influence for his career choice. Of course, The Gold Bug also influences Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, and the basic plot, and Stevenson credits Poe in his foreword. So he's on Sullivan Island, kind of a dead end for him, and he knows he's not going to advance much. But the first thing that happens is in February 1829, his foster mother, Frances Allen, dies at age 44. Now she had been in poor health for some time, for sure. But remember, this was the only person in Poe's life who was the source of any real affection for him and love. And now she's gone too at age 44. Poe at this time pens a well-known poem called The Conqueror Worm. And the Conqueror Worm is, has a very bitter tone to it because he's so, angry, frustrated, and bitter about all the loves in his life dying at such an early age. So on Sullivan Island,
Poe history.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm again. Did someone say something? Okay. Poe feels his position is at a dead end on Sullivan Island. And he really needs to attend West Point in order to join the officer ranks. So it's pretty unexpected to think of Edgar Allan Poe at West Point. When I read about this, I was like really surprised because that's pretty much the last thing I would associate with Edgar Allan Poe and West Point, right? We associate a lot of things with Poe. We do not associate West Point. But in June 1830, he travels to upstate New York and becomes a cadet at West Point, which, it has a very, very strict routine. In those days, a lot of things were forbidden. There was no card playing, no reading novels, there's all kinds of things you couldn't do. Lots and lots of drills, lots of classes. But actually, Poe adjusts very well to military life. However, the same problem that plagued him at UVA plagues him at West Point, which is his foster father, John Allen, who at this point in time had become a very, very wealthy man entirely because of an inheritance. He wasn't really that great of a businessman, but he inherited a huge sum from his uncle. And in spite of this large inheritance, he really doesn't support Poe at all at West Point. And this really makes things very difficult for Poe. And he writes letters home asking for some support. I'm sure he was also, asking for some emotional support as well, in addition to financial. These letters go unanswered. So what ends up happening is John Allen, after the death of his wife, very soon remarries. He has a new family, and he basically shuts Edgar out of his life. So given Poe's background with the abandonment issues we talked about earlier, and his parents, and the loss of his, so much of who he knew, he's really devastated by this rejection, and he loses heart, and he gets himself kicked out of West Point. He doesn't attend the drills, he doesn't attend the classes, and he's eventually court-martialed, and he's found guilty on all charges. He doesn't really put up a defense in the court-martial. So not knowing where to turn, he enters his cousin's home in Baltimore. Now he's 22 years old at this point, and it's the year 1831. So in Baltimore, there are lots of members in the household. There's the grandmother, aunt, brother, 2 cousins. Edgar forms a very close relationship with his aunt, Maria Clem, and her daughter, Virginia. And Maria Clem, this is her. So she's his aunt, his brother's sister. Maria Clem is somebody who really loved Edgar Allan Poe. She was always very supportive to him throughout his life. She supported the household by dressmaking, and that was a very wonderful relationship he had. Edgar also had, Edgar made an instant connection with his cousin, Virginia. He becomes her tutor, and it's a very, see here, this is kind of how she looked at that time. She's a lot younger than he is. She's very gentle. She was a very sweet person, that was often said about her. So this trio of Maria, Virginia, and Edgar, they form a very tight unit, and that's going to be the case throughout Edgar's life. He also has an older brother, Henry, and Henry is a sailor. He sailed all around the world, and he's a short story writer. And it's often said that Henry was a major influence as to why Edgar turned to short story writing. Because after all, Edgar did write under the pen name Henry Le Rene for a little while. So that's kind of a tip-off. In addition, Edgar also sees, as to why Edgar turns to his attention to short story writing as opposed to poetry, some of it honestly was economic. He always had a very keen eye for what the public wanted and what the market wanted. So that was also part of it too. So
it is in Baltimore that Poe launches his career as an imaginative short story writer, writing tales such as Morella, The Assignation, Berenice, and his first science fiction story, The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall. But what made Poe turn to short story writing? He may have been partly inspired by his older brother Henry's works, and Poe had a keen understanding of what the public wanted. Rising literacy rates, urbanization, and technological advances in printing presses increased the public's appetite for stories.
So Poe lives in this transition time between the kind of the waning of the old rural America and the dawning of modern capitalistic commercial America. And just like in Europe during Gutenberg's time when the printing press is invented, you have this kind of explosion of periodicals.
Edgar's room was likely on the top floor. This was where he wrote some of his earliest short stories, including MS Found in a Bottle, that is, manuscript found in a bottle, that wins a $50 prize in a literary contest given by the Baltimore Saturday Visitor. Published in 1833, this story launches Poe's literary career.
So at this point, Edgar suffers another major loss in his life when his brother Henry dies at age 24. He dies just a few months after Edgar moves in to the house in Baltimore. And his brother dies from consumption. So his brother dies from the same disease as his mother, and they both die at the same age of 24 years old. So the remaining members of the household and Edgar, they all move into a house in 1833, and that is still standing today. It's a museum. So maybe some of you have been there. You could visit. I'm actually going this Saturday because there's the Baltimore, there's a Poe festival going on this weekend. That's like once a year. So I'll actually be at this house on this Saturday. But this house that they move into and they give tours of it, it's a very crowded household. They're very poor. Life is hard. It's definitely a struggle. I've been there myself. It's a very cramped house. And it's kind of amazing that all those people live there. Edgar tries to find a teaching position. He's not able to find work. And as referenced in the clip, this is where Poe writes his first great story, Manuscript Found in a Bottle, in 1833. And it wins a short story contest given by a local newspaper. Now, this is very important because this is really the first time that Edgar is receiving, you could say, external validation. It gives him a morale boost, that he has talent. And writing short stories is really something he could do maybe professionally. So it's August 1835, a couple years later, Edgar gets an editor job at the Southern Literary Messenger, and he decamps to Richmond, Virginia, August 1835. Now, this is where he becomes a magazine editor and critic. Being a magazine editor is the way he's going to make his living throughout the rest of his life. So that's a very important thing for him. He's also really, really good at it. He makes magazines popular. He makes them interesting. And he enormously raises the subscriptions. Of course, he never gets a penny for any of this. He's always exploited, always paid poorly throughout his life because he's not the owner of the magazine. So somebody else gets the profit. One of the things I really want to stress in this class is that the world knows Edgar Allan Poe for being a poet and an author, but it's really important to say that he was a magazine editor for many years, but even more than that, he was a literary critic. And this side of him was really very important. He wrote any number of influential essays, and he proposed important literary theories. One of them being like what makes a short story great? Like how to best write a short story to make it powerful and effective. So he's a reviewer for the Southern Literary Messenger. And when he reviews the books that come in, he's actually honest about it. And most of the books are pretty bad, or at best mediocre. So he says that. And his readers are kind of shocked by it, as is everybody else, because they're used to puffing. So in those days, there was sort of this tacit agreement between the publishers and the reviewers, where the reviewers would engage in puffing. They wanted to make American literature stand, sort of, not be second fiddle to Europe. So they sort of, like, you could say, pretended that the works were a lot better than they really were, and they would lavish praise on them. And as magazine editor, Edgar did not want any part of this practice of puffing. And he was, very honest in his reviews, and it's very sort of amusing. And like he did not mince any words when he was reviewing these books. But on the other hand, if he thought something was very good, he would say that. So Mariah and Virginia soon join him in Richmond. So it's the three of them. And the three are a very loving and happy family unit. Although his salary is quite modest, he makes sure Virginia has tutors. She learns music, singing. She really had an excellent voice. She learns Italian, the harp. One visitor remarked how Edgar would teach her algebra. And the two get married in May 1836. So she's quite young, but the marriage is chaste for a number of years. In fact, Edgar refers to her as Sissy. They really almost have a brother-sister kind of dynamic, you might say, for the first number of years in the marriage. Whatever craziness, whatever disappointment was going on in Edgar Allan Poe's life, the one thing he always had was Virginia, because they really loved each other very much. So Edgar, we go into this in the documentary, and Edgar and Poe writes about this. He experiences the imp of the perverse. Those are his words. That phrase, imp of the perverse, is something that kind of lives in like the dark side of human nature. And it wants to kind of sabotage things that are good. It often leads to self-sabotage. So Poe actually has a story called The Imp of the Perverse, in which he sort of explains this phenomenon. His very famous short story, The Black Cat, is also all about the imp of the perverse. So the imp of the perverse is something that we see in Poe's life as it sort of comes alive, and he sort of self-sabotages himself. And he often self-sabotages himself by two ways. Number one, by drinking. Now, Poe handled alcohol horribly. There's a myth about him that he was always drinking. That is absolutely not true. A lot of his life, he wasn't drinking. But here's the thing. When he did drink, it was really bad. And he had like some kind of physiological disorder, which I don't think they understood in those days. And he hardly had to have any alcohol at all. And he would get really, really drunk and be really out of it for days. And it hurt him a lot in life. One thing that is true about him is alcohol did hurt him in a lot of ways. And so one example of that is he loses his job in Richmond. He gets with the editor there, the owner, and they decide to part ways. So another way he self-sabotages himself is sometimes he would turn friends into enemies. So the three of them have a brief stint in New York City, where I imagine some of you are today. They go there in 1837. That doesn't really work out, though, because they encounter it was a terrible time to move into New York City, because that was the Great Recession of 1837. Work is really hard to find. So after a brief stay there, they moved to Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia is really, really important to the story of Edgar Allan Poe. They are going to be there for 6 years, 1838 to 1844. And this really will be one of the most productive times in his life. He's at the height of his creative powers. Philadelphia was the publishing capital of the US at that time. So he gets an unsatisfactory job at Burton's Gentleman's Magazine. This guy named Burton is an actor. He's away a lot. He needs somebody to run the magazine when he's not there. Tells Poe it's going to be a part-time job, just a few hours a week. Of course, that's not true at all. It ends up being a really difficult job that's many, many hours per week, more than full time, and Poe's not really paid for it. He also is not allowed to do the reviews that he likes to do. He doesn't really get to edit the magazine the way he wants to, so he's feeling pretty, miserable there. But in 1839, while at Burton Gentleman's Magazine, he writes one of his most famous works, The Fall of the House of Usher. This is a work written in the Gothic literary tradition. And one theme the story explores is how the fate of the crumbling mansion, with its eye-like windows and dowered landscape, is intertwined with the two troubled proprietors residing in it, Roderick Usher and his twin sister, Madeline. Now, this story really puts Poe on the literary map. The critics highly praise it. The tale is considered a tour de force in language and mood. And Poe, in his literary essays, would often emphasize the importance of a story's opening paragraph. So this is the opening to The Fall of the House of Usher.
During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit.
Poe would often write about what makes a short story powerful and effective. And this is why he's considered one of the pioneers of the modern short story, because of his literary theories, which are influential on later writers. So while in Philadelphia, one of Poe's greatest literary achievements is The Telltale Heart. It's considered one of Poe's masterpieces. I'm sure many of you have read it when you were in school. And one of the themes in this work is that buried secrets do not stay buried. Hidden secrets have a way of erupting to the surface. And what has been concealed within itself will not stay concealed for long. Another thing about this story is it's the idea of the unreliable narrator. Now, Poe was not the first author to use an unreliable narrator, but he was among the earliest writers who did so. So this is The Telltale Heart. Sorry.
True. Nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute.
The mad narrator describes his obsession in killing the old man, as conveyed in this 1928 experimental silent film.
It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. He had the eye of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man and thus rid myself of the eye forever.
The narrator describes how he murders and buries the old man under the floorboards. But when police officers arrive to search his home, he cannot hide his crime. So tormented is he by the increasingly loud sounds in his ears of a beating heart.
No doubt now I grew very pale, but I talked more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound increased. And what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much such a sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? Oh, God! What could I do? I foamed. I raved. I swore. Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here! It is the beating of his hideous heart.
Poe's narrator may be showing us a certain situation or scenario, but the real subject of the tale, in a way, is the narrator's perspective itself. So that focus on the narrator's perspective or point of view will go into, in the 20th century, stream of consciousness writers like Joyce, where the thought process is the interesting thing.
So as Maya said, she was one of the experts we used. She's an assistant professor of literature at Duke University. The Telltale Heart is an early literary example of stream of consciousness writing, where the characters' actual thoughts become the interesting thing. And this would influence later writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf in the 20th century. Now, Poe's greatest achievement in Philadelphia was the invention of the detective genre. In the April 1841 issue of Graham's magazine appeared Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue, inaugurating one of the most popular genres ever conceived, the detective story. Now, the word detective did not yet exist in English, so they were called tales of ratiocination. And they were called that because it was all about deducing things, using reason. So nothing like this had ever been written before in literature.
The Murders in the Rue Morgue, a new kind of story about a character who solves impossible crimes. In this case, two women who have been murdered inside a locked room that's still locked from the inside. When the door is broken down, no murderer is there. How could he have murdered both these women in such a brutal fashion as to shove one of them up the chimney and nobody's seen him? Is it supernatural? Was it a ghost? Well, Poe has a character, a private investigator, Auguste Dupin, who's able to solve the crime using reason and analysis, studying the crime scene, profiling the suspect. And this became the first detective story. A whole new literary genre. Poe became the first American to invent a new literary genre.
So that's pretty powerful, becoming the first, person to invent first American to invent an entire literary genre. Now, the Murders in the Rue Morgue, it's such an important story to know about because it establishes the detective genre and the famous character C. Auguste Dupin. So after visiting the crime scene, Dupin ingeniously deduces how the two women were killed. So this story establishes many of the detective story conventions that we are familiar with today.
Poe's story establishes certain attributes of the detective genre that many authors later follow, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle with Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie with Hercule Poirot. The detective as a detached, gentlemanly amateur not associated with the police. The use of first-person narrator who is a friend of the detective, such as Dr. Watson for Sherlock Holmes or Archie Goodwin for Nero Wolfe. The opening intrusion of the outside world on the detective's bachelor office or quarters, such as 221B Baker Street in London. And using the powers of reason, the detective revealing how the crime was committed. So indebted to Poe was Conan Doyle that he wrote, "Where was the detective story until Poe breathed the breath of life into it?" Doyle also called Poe's detective stories a model for all time. In fact, in Doyle's very first novel, A Study in Scarlet, Watson remarks to Sherlock Holmes,
You remind me of Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin. I had no idea that such individuals did exist outside of stories.
So as the clip shows, the detective figures out the crime by reason, by deduction and logic. And that's a key aspect of C. Auguste Dupin that later detectives follow. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes or Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot would not have been conceived without Poe's Si Auguste Dupin. And all the detective stories in film, television, radio, novels, short stories arise from this one story. So Poe writes a sequel, The Mystery of Marie Roget, and this was the first detective story based on a true crime. The true crime here was actually in New York. There was the murder of a sales girl, and her body's found floating in the Hudson River. This actually happened in New York at the time. So Poe bases The Mystery of Marie Roget on this true story. And of course, many television series, including the long-running program Law and Order, with its rip from the headlines format, follow in the tradition pioneered by Poe. And his third story of ratiocination was the Purloined Letter. And that also takes place in France, just as the others do. And this story involves a queen's stolen letter and how to get it back. So these three were the first detective story. And it was in the Purloined Letter that the detective first smokes a pipe, an attribute Conan Doyle gives to Sherlock Holmes, and also the close friendship between the detective and his partner. So an interesting fact is, it's while in Philadelphia that Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Dickens meet in person, and they form an amicable connection that would last years. And interestingly enough, other than Walt Whitman, Charles Dickens is the only major literary figure that Poe meets in person. So things are going well for Poe in Philadelphia, but then catastrophe strikes. One evening in mid-January 1842, Edgar is relaxing with Maria, listening to his wife sing, play the piano, when suddenly Virginia coughs up blood. And this is a sure sign that she has the dreaded disease, tuberculosis. And she's just 19 years old. The tuberculosis, or consumption, was the cause of more deaths in the industrialized world than any other disease at the time. It was consumption that took Edgar's mother and brother, and it accounted up to 1/4 of all deaths in 19th century America, and it often afflicted the young. And Edgar takes care of Virginia, who would improve sometimes, but only slip back. And he later revealed to a friend, this whole thing of getting better, then slipping back, getting better, slipping back. He has a very famous quote. He says, "I became insane with long intervals of horrible sanity. During these fits of absolute unconsciousness, I drank. God only knows how often or how much. My enemies referred the insanity to the drink rather than the drink to the insanity." This ordeal undoubtedly influenced Poe's tale, The Masque of the Red Death, published in Graham's magazine just 4 months later.
The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour.
Prince Prospero summons 1,000 of his courtiers to take refuge in his castle. They lock down the castle's gates to keep the plague out.
The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence.
The ball is staged in 7 rooms, each painted a different color. In the 7th room is a large ebony clock that chimes on the hour. When the clock chimes midnight, a mysterious figure enters the room, dressed as a victim of the Red Death, instantly striking fear in all.
So This short story is often read as death's inevitability, but in Poe's case, it's the inevitability of Virginia's looming death, because few survive consumption, and one can shut the castle gates and pretend that it's not there and distract themselves, but they can't stop the disease. So in 1844, Poe moves his family to New York City, and they settle in a farmhouse, which today is on 84th and Broadway. Now, it's funny to think of it, but back then it was a very rural area surrounded by a 200-acre working farm. So this is what it looked like in those days. The Poes led a very isolated existence there. And it's at this farmhouse where Poe writes his most famous poem, The Raven. And he does this while working for the New York newspaper, The Evening Mirror, as an assistant editor. Now, this poem makes Poe the most famous poet in America. And the poem is how Poe might imagine things to be once Virginia dies. His sort of proactive processing her impending death, wanting to know if her presence will be felt even after she is gone, and whether they will reunite. How will he come to terms with her death? So The Raven is about a scholar who is left desolate by the death of his beloved Lenore. He tries to put the memory of her out of his mind by reading forgotten lore, but is unable to do so. He vows not to repeat her name, but does so often. And one dreary December night, he is visited by an ominous bird who utters a relentless frame of nevermore.
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more.
Poe later explained that the raven symbolized a mournful and never-ending remembrance. The poem dramatizes the conflict between remembrance and forgetting. If the raven symbolizes never-ending grief, the bust of Pallas Athena signifies intellectual wisdom and scholarship. The raven, perched on Athena's marble bust, conveys grief over hope. The scholar's rationality eclipsed by the raven's dark message of nevermore that only deepens the scholar's melancholy and even overtakes his soul.
So as referenced in the clip, Poe wrote that the raven symbolizes a mournful and never-ending remembrance, which, remember, is something he was quite familiar with in all the loss he had to endure in life, kind of, seeing its way into this poem and his sort of motivation for writing it. So the poem is widely praised for its musicality, stylized language, and supernatural atmosphere. But sadly, even though he pens one of the most popular poems in American history, for his newspaper, The Evening Mirror, he only receives $9 for it. Remember, poverty, sort of getting exploited, these are also important themes, unfortunately, in his life as well. And we even see it in this poem. But the poem surpasses the popularity of any previous American poem. It's reprinted throughout the country. It makes him instantly famous, a popular public speaker, and a sought-after literary figure in New York's fashionable salons. So in the spring of 1846, the Poes moved to a cottage in Fordham, New York, and it's still there today. You can visit. And they were very happy there. By moving to the country, Poe hoped this would improve Virginia's health, but it was not to be. And by year's end, she had a very hard time breathing. And at the end of January 1847, so she was only at this cottage for about 9 months or so. 5 years after rupturing a blood vessel while singing, Virginia dies at age 24, the same age as Edgar's mother and brother. So in the months following his wife's death, Poe falls into a deep depression. One friend recalled, the loss of his wife was a sad blow to him. He did not seem to care after she was gone, whether he lived an hour, a day, a week, or a year. She was his all. And he later composed a heartfelt poem, Annabel Lee, for her, in which the love between a young couple is so great, it evokes the envy of the angels in heaven and the demons under the sea, who put an early end to it. But their love extends beyond the grave.
It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived, whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in hell, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee.
So we wanted to say a couple of words about Eureka. After Virginia's death, Poe begins working on a prose poem titled Eureka, and it's an essay on the material and spiritual universe. And it contains over 20 ideas and concepts that were revolutionary in 1848, but are now a part of everyday science, like the Big Bang and expanding universe, ideas about the velocity of light, and so forth. We also wanted to sort of make you aware that one fascinating but often overlooked aspect of Poe is his role as a pioneer of the science fiction genre by applying the scientific thinking and knowledge of his time to a work of fiction. And Poe also influenced the two fathers of science fiction, who are Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, who, along with Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, helped establish the science fiction genre. So some science fiction tales include the unparalleled adventures of one Hans Pfaall, the balloon hoax, and Poe often wrote hoaxes as science fiction stories, in which Poe describes a 3-day transatlantic flight by hot air balloon in extraordinary technical detail, and this story fooled many people. The apocalyptic short story, The Conversation of Eros and Charmian, his only novel, Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, which has a lot of science fiction in it. And of course, 3 Sundays in a Week, and this story inspires Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. And his story, The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, was included in the very first science fiction magazine in 1926. So we just have a couple of minutes left before we're going to take your questions and answers, but I just want to touch a little bit on his death. So if we fast forward to September 1849, Poe is now living in Richmond. The really sad thing is, he finally in his life, everything's looking up for him. He's soon to marry a wealthy widow who loves him. She could put an end to his poverty. He's on the verge of achieving his lifelong dream of launching a literary magazine. He's with old and new friends. And in this wonderful spirit of things, he takes a journey to pick up his aunt, Maria Clem, in New York, in order for her to join them in Richmond. And when he arrives in Baltimore by steamship on September 28th, all he has to do is just take the train to head north. But he doesn't take the train, and that's a mystery today. Instead, he vanishes in Baltimore for 6 days, and nobody knows where he went or why. So he's vanished for 6 days, and on October 3rd, a printer named Joseph Walker discovers Poe at Gunners Hall, and it was an Irish tavern that was serving as a polling place on Election Day. Now, when he's discovered, Poe is in a semi-conscious state. He's wearing somebody else's clothes. So it's often thought that Poe was a victim of cooping. And cooping is on Election Day, thugs essentially kidnap people. They tie them up in the basement, they apply them with alcohol, and they dress them in different clothes in order to go around voting and voting and voting for their candidate. So Poe is immediately taken to Washington Medical College, where he's treated by Dr. John Moran, a young physician, and he remains there for 4 days. And he's often in delirium. On his final night, he begins calling out for Reynolds, which he did through the night until Sunday morning. Reynolds, Reynolds. Nobody knows who Reynolds was. And his last words before expiring were, "Lord, help my poor soul." So Poe dies at the Washington Medical College on Sunday, October 7th at 5 a.m., aged 40 years and 9 months. He's buried the next afternoon in Baltimore's Presbyterian Cemetery. Only 7 people attend his funeral. The ceremony lasts 3 minutes. One observer describes it as cold-blooded and unchristian-like. He's buried in a family plot that for many years had no headstone to identify him. But even though it took decades, he was eventually recognized for his genius, having pioneered 3 literary genre tales: the horror tale, the detective story, and science fiction. His critical essays helped establish the modern short story. He popularized cryptography and may have even contributed to our understanding of the universe. So he's influenced countless writers and artists through the ages, even long after his troubled yet remarkable life. So thank you so much for your attendance and attention. We'd love to get your questions or comments, and feel free to email me at this email address after the presentation if you have any questions that come to mind. And if you'd like to see the full documentary we made, it's available on Amazon Prime Video.
This has really been wonderful, very touching, very sad to say the least. You've done a terrific job of showing so much of him. I had no idea. Karen, if I can call on you, you taught literature, you very familiar with Poe. I'd just love to get some of your comments, and if you have any questions for Andrew, that would be great.
Yes, I did teach several of Poe's short stories when I was teaching high school English back shortly after Poe's death. No, not quite. And they're great stories to teach to high school kids. They really are, especially stories like The Telltale Heart, often because the prose is completely understandable. His vocabulary doesn't turn high school kids off. If I'm remembering correctly, and it was a while ago, but the vividness of it, and they loved his stories. I didn't teach any of the detective stories. I did teach The Telltale Heart, I remember, and Cask of Amontillado, and The Pit and the Pendulum. They liked that one as well. And your illustrations were wonderful. They really were. We didn't have I think a lot of his stories were anthologized in my 11th grade American literature text that I use, but there were no illustrations, and they really added to it a lot. So thank you.
Oh yeah, and there was sort of a golden, as many of you probably know, there really was like a golden age of illustrators from, let's say, 1880 to maybe the 1920s. So really, some of the great illustrators in history illustrated many of his works.
Do you want to mention some of them? Any of them come to mind?
Well, yeah. For example, Harry Clarke, who also died very young in life. I think he died the same age as Poe, age 40. He was Irish. So the greatest illustrator of Poe is considered to be Harry Clarke, and you saw some of his illustrations in the clips and in the images. Another really famous illustrator was Arthur Rackham, and Arthur Rackham was a little bit more literal. See, Harry Clarke was more stylistic, and he had a lot of influence on other artists and illustrators. So you could tell that it was a Poe story, but it had a tremendous amount of style and sort of a little bit of abstraction. Whereas Arthur Rackham's illustrations are more sort of representational, but really, really well done. Gustave Doré illustrated a lot of Poe's The Raven. So those, would be three. But we used many illustrators for this film.
Right.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really enjoying this. I didn't realize that Edgar Allan Poe had done all the work that he had done. I never read his short stories in school, but as you showed The Raven,
Whoops, sorry.
when I was in school, as you showed The Raven and Annabel Lee, I realized that I must have memorized it because I knew what was happening. So it must have made a very big impression on me. Thank you very much. I will watch the documentary, and I will certainly read more about Edgar Allan Poe. Thank you for giving me this.
Thank you.
Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I have one other funny anecdote. I usher off Broadway, and I forgot one theater company, we had a badge and it said usher, and some person that I was showing to his seat said, "Oh, I'm so sorry about the fall of your house." Okay, thank you. And I'm guessing that some people might not have gotten it, but I certainly did. And I don't know if any of you remember the TV series Matinee Theater. They did a dramatization of Fall of the House of Usher a long time ago, and it was almost like a mini series, if I'm remembering correctly. I'll have to go to IMDb to check, but I think it was televised. Do you have any recollection? Do you have any knowledge of that, Andrew?
I don't. I don't. But what's interesting is, just to show you Poe's enduring popularity, Netflix had a very well-received drama called The Pale Blue Eye, which is a phrase from The Telltale Heart that did great.
Can you repeat that? Sorry, just repeat the title.
Yeah, it's called The Pale Blue Eye on Netflix, and that did really well on Netflix. And interestingly enough, that entire drama, it's like a mystery, is all about Poe's time in West Point. If you remember earlier on in the presentation, we discussed his time at West Point, which I didn't know that much about Poe before I started this project. And I was really surprised he had spent so much of his life in the military. But yeah, and there was another, Netflix also did The Fall of the House of Usher very recently. So kind of just shows you the enduring popularity and appeal that never always seems to be there.
He seems to be the epitome of the suffering writer. I mean, you think what a terrible life he had, but in some ways, maybe it made him a better writer. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I think that I think there's definitely a lot of truth to that. He did lead a very hard life, honestly. He really did, and it was a short life, only 40 years and 9 months. And I think that for me, that's what makes his relationship with Virginia so poignant. Because I'm not usually a romance person. I don't care that much, honestly. But like I was just not my thing or whatever. But I was very moved by their story, and Virginia really, from everything I read, okay, and all the source material, she was such a sweet and gentle soul. She really was. If we had more time in the presentation, but you could see it in the film, I would have played for you the beautiful acrostic she writes for Edgar. But I think it sort of inspires some of his writing, like Annabel Lee and The Raven. As far as one interesting thing to think about was, was Poe idealistic? Was there idealism with him, the way there might have been with some of his contemporary writers? And I think that Poe was idealistic in one way, and it was being idealistic about literature, American literature. He wasn't really interested in politics, by the way, even though a lot was going on at that time that was very important. That just wasn't his thing. But what he really wanted more than anything was to establish his own literary magazine. And that's really where his idealism came out. He wanted it to be excellent quality and to show that America could stand its own. It's not just Europe with great literature. America could be a place too.
How did you, well, a couple last questions. How did you get interested in Poe?
Well, I was thinking, I was very intrigued by his life. I was intrigued by the fact that, here's somebody who is so incredibly prolific. And I wanted to know more about him. I wanted to understand him more as a man. Like, what made him tick? What motivated him? Who did he love? What frustrated him in life? And I knew that his works were real gems, and I wanted to sort of learn more about some of his greatest works. In this project, I watched different films, documentaries. Maybe some of you, have any of you watched Roger Corman's films that he made on about Poe's works? I'm just curious. Does anybody here, and is he Masque?
I read about them. They sounded too gory for me.
Right. So these were released in the 1960s, the early to mid 1960s. So I watched a lot of those films by Roger Corman. And I think I was just really fascinated by his life and by his works. And I really wanted to get to know his works much, much better. And I got to spend a lot of time reading his short stories, his essays. Remember, one of the things we tried to emphasize in this class was, sure, the world knows him as a poet. And of course, he at heart was a poet and as an author. But remember, also as a critical essayist, very important. He wrote a lot of essays, and they were influential. The philosophy of composition, for example, kind of explains what makes a short story work.
So last question from me, and if anybody else wants to ask a question or make a comment, that'd be great. You probably noticed that the people here today are all women, and I'm wondering, do you think he had and has more appeal for some reason to women than to men, or is this just a statistical fluke, as we would say?
I think he got along better with women. In his life, he didn't get along as well with men. Like, for example, somebody mentioned the Cask of Amontillado. Karen, I think, mentioned the Cask of Amontillado. It was at that time he was involved in a huge lawsuit against a man for libel. He sort of quarreled a lot with men. I think he did get along better with women. He definitely drew a lot of women. They were interested in him. After we didn't have time to get into this in the presentation. You sort of have to choose the sections you'll go into. But after Virginia dies, I want you all to know that he was, because of his abandonment early in life and the losses he had to endure, he really needed a woman. He's like, no, he's not going to live the rest of his life alone. That's not happening with him. He can't do that. So of course he has his aunt, Maria Clem, and this is all in the film, but he is kind of funny in a way. He courts all these women. It's unbelievable, almost at the same time. So he seems to have a real need and draw for women. I mean, in his life, in the presentation, we talked about Jane Stannard, we talked about Frances Allen, we talked about his beloved mother, Eliza Poe. I honestly think he did have more in common with women. He did. He had more of a draw with men. For some reason, it was a more complicated thing for him.
Interesting.
I have a question to ask you. All this crooking that he may have been a victim of, I don't really know what that means. You said it had to do with voting. So did the perpetrators dope up people and lead them around to vote the way they wanted? How did that work?
So the way it would work, and by the way, and this isn't like a plug for see it for free, but we really do go into this in the film because we want people to understand, exactly how it worked. But the way it was kind of crazy, right? In Baltimore and other cities, it was a crooked system. It was totally crooked. So you would have both political parties who, in order to gin up more votes for their candidate, basically hire thugs to kidnap sailors, like in Baltimore, it would be sailors, it would be strangers, not anybody who was very well known. But there were a lot of those people walking around in Baltimore. They would kidnap them, coop them up in the basement. That's why it was called cooping. And they would ply them with alcohol and sort of make them, obey them. And they would have them wear like different clothes so they could vote multiple times. So they would take them around, like with the horse and wagon to different polling places. They would vote, then they might, shave off their mustache or something, put them in someone else's clothes, then they would go somewhere else and vote. And they kept doing this over and over again. I guess, in close elections, that could make the difference. So Poe is very, very sensitive to alcohol. We know this about him. He would become delirious if he had too much. There's no question about that. And he had undergone deliriums before in earlier episodes. So the reason he's found in a semi-conscious state is very likely because he was a victim of cooping. I mean, after all, he was found in a polling place on election day in someone else's clothes. That is exactly. Right. And by the way, when you start to fight back, or they can't use you anymore, they just dump you out on the street. And that's exactly what they did. And that's why Poe was discovered on the street, right outside the polling place. We have a picture of it, of where that Irish tavern used to be. And that's what they would do. It was a crazy practice.
I've never heard of that before. That's like unbelievable.
It's unbelievable.
I don't know.
It really is.
It's heard of this.
Yeah, please don't spread the word. Don't spread the word to the Republicans, please.
I was thinking that this is something Trump might try to pull.
Well, let's just say the interesting thing is things take on different forms over time, shall we say? So the form changes, but this idea of trying to, work has been a long history. So
yeah,
with
okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, certainly. This has been really wonderful, and I think as I said at the beginning, I think we all knew something about Poe, if at least one or two poems, but very little. So thank you for enriching our knowledge and making it so fascinating. And we wish you a lot of luck. We'll put information about your documentary in the email that we send out. Thank you very much. And thank your cat too, Andrew. Okay.
Oh, I will. And thank you everybody for coming and for your attention and wonderful questions. And it was really great, to be with you all. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Take care. All the best.
Thank you, Judy.